Okay, again, welcome to this evening's event, and we will start, please. On behalf of my colleagues in the Department of Architecture and Design and my colleagues in the Committee for the Areen Architecture Series, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us in this inauguration event of the Areen Architecture Lecture Series. I hope there will be many, many more to come. I would like first to thank all my colleagues, faculty members, students, and the staff at the Department of Architecture and Design and throughout AUB, the Office of the President, the Office of Communications, and the Office of Development for making this event happen. I want in particular to thank a colleague of ours, Joseph Chartouni, for actually taking a very critical role for making the visit of Rem Koolhaas possible to Beirut. This event is possible because of a very generous gift given to the Department of Architecture and Design by Mr. Bassem Ziadeh of the Areen Foundation. And I cannot thank him enough. I know on behalf of every one of you in the auditorium who are going to enjoy this evening's event and many events to come, that I am thanking him on your behalf. And I would like, since this is the inauguration event, to ask him to the podium to come and take a vow and say a few words. Bassem, please.
Hello, and thank you for coming. I want to start off by saying that we've approached a lot of architects to launch this lecture series, and we're really excited to have Rem Koolhaas, a giant in contemporary architecture, with us today. We feel this helps us launch our series at an extremely high level, which is exactly what we wanted. The aim of this program is to get the world's top architects to come and speak here at AUB. But first, let me give you a bit of background about us and who we are. We set up Areen Design in Beirut 32 years ago in 1978. By we, I mean 3 architecture graduates from AUB, myself, Mataz Sawaf, and Omar Salha. Over the years, we've continued working together, and we've achieved success and recognition in the world of construction and design. We all owe a lot to AUB, and this is our way of trying to give something back. And now about the lecture series itself. We will be inviting famous first-class architects to come and lecture at AUB twice a year. The lecture series is open to the public, and we're expecting 300 to 400 people to attend each event. By getting the giants of contemporary architecture to come and speak, we hope to raise the profile of AUB and get coverage in the media. Hopefully, these lectures can become international cultural events, putting AUB on the map and making it part of the global lecture circuit that prestigious architects speak at. Of course, this lecture series is not only for AUB's profile, it's also for the architecture students sitting in front of me here today, who will greatly benefit from the exposure which will happen in a variety of ways. Firstly, we feel it's one thing to read about an architect, but it's a completely different experience when you actually get to see them face to face. It's great to be able to hear what drives each one of these successful individuals. I'm looking forward to finding out. Some architects will have a success story to tell us. Some will be a bit more nostalgic. All will give good advice to the students. Each architect will approach each talk differently. A bit of personal storytelling is invaluable for a student to hear. Secondly, we hope that some of these visiting architects will find time to offer workshops and seminars to our final year students. We really want to expose students at the AUB to discussions with successful practicing architects. We feel that this sort of interaction could be extremely beneficial. Lastly, this is the start of a permanent program which will become a regular fixture in the department's schedule, giving students the chance to listen, meet, and talk to several leading world-class architects, which we feel is a good opportunity for everyone. Thank you very much.
Pardon my 150 centimeters. Okay, I guess the great thanks go to our guest speaker, Rem Koolhaas, for making it here. I feel extremely privileged to introduce him, and extremely thankful again for his visit to Beirut despite his very, very busy schedule and extreme busy commitments. But I will not do the conventional biographical introduction for many, many reasons. He's known to all of you, and it's clear testimony from the attendance. He's internationally acclaimed, award-winning, recognized architect and urbanist, and his bio would be too long to read, and the brief introduction is what I will choose to do, to give him the precious time and to have him talk to you instead of me introducing him. I would like, however, to say a few words in terms of reflection about Rem Koolhaas being here today at AUB and being here today in Beirut. The department takes extreme pride in its focus on the city, studying it, investigating it, top-down, bottom-up approaches, interdisciplinary methods. The city is central to our discourse in architecture and graphic design, in urban design, and urban planning and policies. We share that passion with Koolhaas. We want to learn what he's learned about investigating the city in his own career. So it's quite meaningful for us to listen and dialogue with him on the city. Beirut is an irrational culture that he loves to study and has studied in his first book about New York and in his second book. He worked in all the cities he worked in, from Lagos to Lahore, with his partners at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. Koolhaas sets an example of an architecture that submits itself to realities on the ground. In his graduate seminar, Generic Cities of the Developing World, he does not investigate how those places can be rationalized, but how to learn from their irrationalities. Since his celebration of New York in his book, Delirious New York, as cities within cities that thrive on what he called culture of congestion, and that's where we intersect in Beirut with New York. Koolhaas continues to raise new urban questions. In his second book, SMLXL, he proposed that if there is to be a new urbanism, it will be the staging of uncertainty. It will no longer be concerned with the arrangements of more or less permanent objects, but with irrigation of territories, with the potential that they can have. It will no longer aim for the stable configurations, but for the creation of enabling fields that accommodate processes that refuse to be crystallized into definitive form. It will no longer be obsessed with the city, but the manipulation of the infrastructure for endless intensification and diversification. Shortcuts, he says, redistributions, and therefore the reinvention of psychology of space. So I am certain that the Rem Koolhaas encounter will be a rich one that will raise new questions about what is urban, and will leave Beirut and Koolhaas with more reflections. With that, I ask you to join me in welcoming Rem Koolhaas to the podium.
Thank you very much. It is, of course, really wonderful to be here. I'm very happy with the mood in the auditorium. And I would like to give you a little bit of a kind of announcement of the kind of lecture I hope to give. We've done a lot of work, and typically I don't really like presenting recent work. I typically like to try to give a kind of small introduction, or to try to explain, not particularly in educational situations, to not explain our work, but to explain where our work comes from and what we think we are doing with our work. Of course, we're responding to very specific situations, we're responding to clients, we're responding to requests, but I think beyond that there is a kind of larger issue. The issue, what do I see as the mission of the office? Where do we sometimes achieve that mission, and where do we fail that mission? And in that sense, I would like to share this afternoon a number of different aspects and different ambitions that we have been developing over the years, and that enable us to address a large scale of, a large panorama of different issues. But anyway, I think it's becoming clear in the lecture. We are now 230 people, and these are the places we work. More about that later, because for reasons that are becoming more and more important, and that are also connected, of course, to globalization, the question where you work is less and less innocent. Here you see in color the human development scale, and you see that although there's still a lot of work we do in Europe, that a lot of the work is now in other sections of the world where the Human Development Index, whatever that is gray, dark gray and black. That has a kind of very big effect on architecture, and it's probably not a secret that I'm not 100% happy with the current condition of architecture, and it may be slightly hypocritical that somebody like me declares himself not entirely happy, but I will try to explain. This is what we all recognize as architecture. It's in your country, but I use it always, wherever I am, because I think it's one of the most compelling and beautiful examples. What is touching about this image is that everyone knows immediately not only what it is, but also what it expresses. It's clearly a collective, a public statement, and it is clearly a statement about and it's clearly a statement about the values of a particular society. More and more, I think that that kind of statement becomes harder to make, and I think that the overall explanation why it is harder and harder is the fact that in the past 20 years we have lived in the age of privatization. We have witnessed, both in Europe and America, in the Lebanon, basically everywhere on the world, a massive shift from the public sector to the private sector. And for me, that has had a kind of incredible effect on architecture, because where the architect was typically the one who expressed the values of the public sector, we are now expressing the value of the private sector. And so therefore, even though this was architecture, after these 20 years, now this is architecture. And I love the work and respect the work of Frank Gehry, but nevertheless, I think that what you see here is that it's not the same kind of architecture. It doesn't express the values of a particular society. It expresses more the aspirations, perhaps, of one particular museum. And in aesthetic terms, it expresses the courage or daring of ingenuity of Frank Gehry. And clearly, that is a kind of really a massive change. And that massive change has had, in my view, a really radical effect on architects. This is the American architect Peter Eisenman. In the center of a museum, of a monument that was built to remember the disappearance of the Jews from Berlin. And you see that the architect here is being pursued by a horde of paparazzi, and that therefore any dignity that they might have had before, given the subject, you definitely would expect a certain dignity of the kind of interaction between him and the media is really completely gone, and he is hunted and hiding in the center of this scheme. This venture is the typical, so there's something here so fragile that it's not resisting my presence. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I would say that this is the current situation of the architect. And so I'm not trying to ridicule Daniel Libeskind. It's a picture, where every architect needs to seriously think whether they're not very often in the same position. So I think that, 2,000 years ago, obviously it was a very serious profession. Now it is a profession with a number of kind of very dubious sides. And what we increasingly produce as part of this kind of dubious condition is the well-known word icons. And perhaps this is, for me, the kind of perfect icon, a completely boring building that has no particular qualities, that could be anywhere, that presumably serves some purpose, but it's completely invisible which purpose. And it's also invisible, you could never guess which particular nationality produced this, which culture. It could be Singaporean, it could be from Ecuador, it could be from Kuwait, but it happens to be French. And again, it is not to denigrate my colleagues, but it is more to kind of suggest to you that somehow we are all in the same kind of situation, and to show that we produce this image, which is really some of the high rises of the major architects in the world in the past 10 years. And you begin to realize that if you add the current architectural production together, that it becomes a kind of self-defeating effort, and that the sum total of our production at this moment is less than the sum of the parts. And I think that's a very disturbing situation. And of course, the term star architect kind of perhaps defines perfectly that impasse or that crisis. And in a certain way, this lecture is intended by me to discuss it a little bit. This is, and just like the temple and the image of Gehry, you have to compare these two images as well. The architect now and the architect only 20 years ago. I want to discuss this architect, and I want to even be this architect. It's a kind of very dour person without any glamour. He probably has a kind of very serious and possibly rather dull architectural project in his hands. He has, however, the great virtue or excitement that the project is being built by a very disciplined group of people, and that there's a direct connection between his ambition and realization. And what you can already see is that the building that he realizes is not some kind of frivolous and possibly unnecessary piece of decoration, but that it emanates in every aspect great seriousness and great necessity. And this is the kind of architecture that this kind of architect used to produce. And what is extremely ironic and painful of the current situation is that whether we want to or not, we have no access to this architectural role anymore. We are so, on the one hand, central to the stage, but at the same time marginalized in terms of serious architectural efforts. It has been at least 20 years that anybody has ever asked our office to do social housing. And that is a symptom of perhaps an intensification of the architectural repertoire, but at the same time a complete elimination of some of the very serious sectors that architects used to be able to operate in. So it's a kind of very, maybe an intensity of performance, but a very narrowness of the terrain. So in many ways you could explain our work as a kind of attempt to outwit that situation and to deal with that situation in a way which doesn't necessarily simplistically create a kind of nostalgia for that previous world, but that tries to strategize how one can operate in this effort. And from a very early moment, research has been key to that kind of effort. Because I would say that research and thinking and acquiring knowledge is really what for us is always a precondition for even the beginning of effort. So I've called this lecture Navigating Modernization, and I want to kind of explain two aspects of it for you. The first is a kind of really almost a mechanical aspect where navigating modernization is kind of simply an effort to understand what modernization means. Not in terms of changing countries, but simply in terms of dealing with a number of inventions that have changed architecture in a way that you could not imagine even 100 or 120 years ago. And this is a kind of cloud of inventions that started maybe kind of around 1750, that goes from the stethoscope to the Morse code to electricity to light, etc., etc. I would still say that we are all part of this groundswell of modern inventions. And in Delirious New York, a book I published in '78, I tried to understand how this cloud or how this wave had swept away the old architecture away, and what the features and what the possibilities of the new architecture were instead. And I think it's impossible to think of our own work without reference to this early investigation, because it convinced me that architecture would never be the same again. Now, this is New York, and this is Coney Island. And I think the key to understanding New York, but also the modern time, age, is of course density. Basically never have so many people been assembled in such small territories, and the territory that alone, I think, explains architecture today. The second one is a number of inventions, very limited in fact, of which perhaps the most important one is the elevator, which was invented and proposed to the public in 1850, and which was immediately understood to radicalize architecture. And this is a cartoon that appeared almost 20 years after the invention of the elevator, and which, in combination with the steel frame, completely theorized what architecture would be like from now on. It would not be simply houses in different styles, That was the old architecture. What the architecture would from now on be is simply a skeleton, an infrastructure made out of steel, repeating a single plot an almost unlimited amount of times, and creating inside the building a number of virgin territories that could then be settled by other architects. So what I find in retrospect particularly spectacular is the shortness of the time of the invention and the understanding. If you look in our current moment 20 years back, you don't have a sense that anything was invented, and you have a kind of sense of stagnation in the culture. This, at the end of the 19th century, that was of course radically different, because basically in a period of 20 years this sequence could happen. And it's a total break, of course, and simply it's the pure application of these two entities. But it was not only steel, not only the elevator, and a very important other element was of course electricity, and particularly the application of electricity to the surfaces of a building. This is another one of those very early kind of sketches, which has and this is a picture of the interior, 6 different outlets as part of the furniture, and these outlets are salt air, fresh air, salt air, dry fresh air, but also perfumes and medicated air. And so here you have in a very condensed period of 30 years a kind of really radical program for architecture, where not only the size changed, not only the territories that you could reach by mechanical means in the sky, so therefore the level of artificiality, but also the interior was no longer natural or part of the exterior, but it was now a kind of bubble that could be defined by completely artificial means at the service of whatever program. And so it's kind of really my fascination for this kind of combination of different steps, in themselves not really major, and all occurring in this very short period, that enabled architecture to be kind of really radically different. And perhaps no building expressed it better than this one, and that is also key. Very often the buildings that were the outcome of these incredible inventions were really dull and boring, and so therefore they don't represent architectural excitement per se, but they represent a kind of intellectual excitement that inside them life is being reinvented. This building is the Downtown Athletic Club, 1931 in Manhattan, a series of floors dedicated to totally different sports. And I want to show this floor, the 9th floor, which had a locker room, a dressing room, a boxing ring, so you undress and then you box, but also next to it is an oyster bar. And so what is totally kind of amazing is again the combination of different activities that through these inventions could be arranged on a single floor. And again, the architectural quality of this plan is pathetic, but what it introduces in terms of how life can be lived is kind of really pretty radical. And so it is kind of really that kind of radicalism that inspired us, and that is still a kind of driving force behind everything we do, I would say. And of course you cannot always invest all your ambitions in a single project, but at the same time I would say that our overall enterprise represents an effort to embrace that interconnected series of inventions, and then to see how architecture can benefit from them, perhaps on a less naive level and on a kind of more professional level than in the examples that I showed you, which importantly were not done or conceived by so-called architects or people who were kind of formally recognized as such. So perhaps the first time that we ourselves were able to begin to speculate on those terms was when we had to do a kind of very large library in Paris. It was 10 years after the publication of Delirious New York, where we had to, and the program consisted, it was a building of 250,000 square meters, so unimaginably big for Europe, and we had to incorporate in this building 5 different entities, 5 different libraries and a cinematheque, so a kind of very diverse program. And as it very often does in our work, the project started on my part with a kind of resistance or even aversion to the idea that we had to invent 5 different shapes or 5 different architectures, or had to kind of somehow make differences between these 5 different entities. So it started with a kind of very stupid sketch, and the question that this sketch kind of raises is, okay, libraries are usually storage, so one thing that will be kind of inevitable will be a lot of floors, and all those floors there is kind of, in a very contemporary sense, simply process. And instead of making these 5 different forms, what we will do, we excavate from those floors different shapes and different bubbles according to the examples I showed you. The air can, so it's like kicking tires and the code isn't working.
It's not from the mic. Please use this.
Huh? No, I think, okay, I'm fine. I won't move anymore. Basically, by not making these forms and not having to design them, but simply eliminating them, we thought we were making our lives easier. And this was a model we made, and because it was quite a difficult concept, because the key of the thing were absences of form, were voids. We had to make a reverse model where we represented everything that was void as a solid. And so here you see how all those different voids coexisted in this kind of same building, and clearly that, and here you see again how they kind of floated. This is a project by, from '89, how they floated in this sea of storage, and how they were excavated from the sea of storage, and how by making them negative shapes or voids, we made our life much more easy than it is for the contemporary architect. And you probably recognize the kind of architecture that is produced in unimaginable quantities today, which is kind of really stuck in this moment, kind of simply because it has to be fabricated and it's not a void. So anyway, these were the 5 libraries. Here are the elevators that connect them, and here are the kind of floors of storage in which they're embedded. And here is the kind of building that was the kind of overall outcome, you know, a kind of block of semi-transparency, sometimes revealing the floating shapes that were inside, like here, and here, kind of tunnel, sometimes giving revelations of what was happening inside, but on the whole, kind of very mysterious condition. And I would say that this is perhaps the most radical iteration we were ever able to make, you know, of these inventions, and how these inventions could also become kind of part of a kind of really serious architecture. And it also, I think, is a very pure example of our reluctance to make form and our pressure to make form only when strictly necessary. Nobody can deny, of course, that these are forms, and nobody can deny that there is a kind of certain invention in the forms, but still, in terms of how we impose it on the public realm, this degree of reticence remains characteristic, I think. This is a kind of recent project which is, in a way, on a smaller scale, trying to do the same thing. It's a concert hall in Porto. Everyone knows that a shoebox is the ideal acoustic shape. Most architects are trying to make interesting shoeboxes, but in this case we try to make a volume interesting by eliminating the shoebox. So just like the very big library, we created the main thing of the building as a void, as an absence. So here you see it, a kind of tunnel that runs almost through the entire building. And in a certain way this is also an effort to deal with modernization, but in this case not so much on the level of mechanical systems or steel, or it's a building in concrete, but to deal with another condition that in the current culture a concert hall is considered elitist. And what we try to do here by having these windows is not only to influence the room and to give it a view, but also to broadcast to the public that something is going on here, and to some extent even make the public to some extent participant in the events. It's a building that is kind of very public. It's also open to the public almost 15 hours per day, or sometimes more. And it's in a very special location that enables you on the one hand to see the center of Porto, and on the other side to see the Atlantic. A second building which I want to show, also kind of relatively recent, which is also connected, again more connected perhaps to the early part of the lecture, the elevator, the bubble, the steel, is the library in Seattle, where we had a kind of very complex program, and where we simply analyzed the program on very two binary conditions. To the right, everything that we thought would change very soon, and to the left, everything that we thought would remain rather stable over time. So the building is in a way a kind of diagram that also deals with the current condition. We have very different speeds, variable speeds with which components of each building age and change. So in these boxes, we had kind of highly organized, highly traditional, highly rigorous planning, and in between we had accommodated all the spaces and all the activities and all the programs that were changing, that were very susceptible to change, either technological or social. So it's a building that has a stable part, and in between an unstable part, and those almost like a barcode interlocking. So this is the stable part, and you see that on these terraces there are kind of almost like landscapes, and like any landscape you can easily transform it and renovate it and make it completely different. So here the core, the skin, and the building. Perhaps the building, the most ambitious building we did recently is a building in China for Central China Television. And that building is on our part also an effort to intervene in the current architectural condition, and particularly to try to convince the world, and of course in saying it I know it will be a complete failure, but to convince the world to abandon high-rise in the traditional, in the way in which it is currently applied, as a kind of icon, kind of basically as stupid as the egg I showed you before. And the question here was, what does importance mean at this moment, and what does celebrity mean? And what is important to also realize about this project is that it happened at the moment that we had a serious dilemma. In 2001, we were asked to participate in two competitions. One was to reconstruct the World Trade Center, and the second one was to construct the headquarters of Central China Television. And in a way, you can see we refused to work on World Trade Center because I did not have any confidence that would not be kind of marooned in a kind of profound nostalgia. But what we did, we took the disappeared World Trade Center and we reconfigured it in a loop. And that was really our gesture, almost like a kind of new beginning, or basically saying that the skyscraper could be kind of a much more interesting thing. The skyscraper did not necessarily simply have to be a kind of exclamation mark, something that consumed ground but didn't create more than that, didn't create urban space. Simply by creating this loop, we were making connections inside, of course, but also in the city, creating a particular moment of definition, of a particular definition. What was more, the shape itself would be unstable. It would never be the same from any angle. And of course, although it is typically photographed, and this is how narrow the current perception of architecture is, it's typically photographed as a window. In many cases, it's more like a tower, or you don't even see the window because it's so versatile in its difference. Now, as we always do, what do we think, why do we do a kind of building like this, and what do we try to achieve there? And I think in this case, there were many different ambitions. There were political ambitions, but there were also the ambition, maybe it's a kind of didactic ambition, but to see whether we could enlarge in China the possibilities of construction. And that was not simply a kind of egotistical ambition, but simply to see whether we could introduce in China other ways of doing things. And this is a kind of diagram of the skin unfolded made by our engineers, showing where the structure is highly stressed and where it is less stressed. And what we did was where the structure, instead of reinforcing it in the traditional way, where the structure is highly stressed, we doubled it, and where the structure is little stressed, we eliminated it. So although this diagram is strictly rational, it has also, of course, a kind of designed or poetic, almost like a children's drawings quality. And one of our real achievements, I would say, is to be able to push this concept through a culture that is deeply kind of dedicated to classical engineering, to trying to define the most efficient path for gravity from the top to below. It really became an almost continuous seminar over a space of 2 years with the elite of Chinese engineering to try to convince them that this could happen, that this was plausible, and that this could unlock possibilities also for them and for Chinese architects. Here you see the kind of model we had to make, a structural model that was shaken to create the last proof. So here you see it. Here now, this is the point where the two are joined. The second kind of really important for us point was, of course, to try to change Chinese media. Again, perhaps a very risky decision. And of course, in Europe and America, we were seriously criticized for our choice for China instead of ground zero. But what we were able to do is to introduce in this building a path through which the Chinese public for the first time is enabling to visit its own media. So this is a loop taking in every single department where the Chinese can visit their own company. And what the building is otherwise is a highly complex kind of diagram of its own organization, filmmaking, broadcasting, administration, creative activities. And the point of the loop is, of course, that each of these parties is part of the single organism, and that there is no avoiding each other, and that it becomes a kind of almost collective responsibility what the media are. So that ambition stands, but of course there is a number of other consequences of a building like this which you cannot control. And one very clearly was that we then became almost inevitably part of the symbolism of the new China, as you see here, or as you saw kind of during the Olympics. But for me, what is kind of really much more important and touching, this was a poem, you probably all know under what circumstances Chinese workers recruited from the countryside have to kind of live in their buildings as they work. But this was a poem that we found, which was made by a worker who wrote it on one of the steel beams, and which for us was much more important than any of these conditions here. Our final ambition with the building, I would say, is of course only now becoming visible, and for me that is not only an aesthetic statement, but also to some extent a political statement, that we did a building which is not, which perhaps in a certain angles is an impressive building, but it's not excessively big. Many buildings around it are bigger, but it is really unique in its ability. So this is the formal thing, but it's this is the architectural photographers, kind of group of very limited and narrow-minded people who are always trying for the money shot. But this is for me kind of really a much more kind of true picture of the whole thing, where through its imperfection and it kind of relates to one of the hutongs around it, and that is for me one of the current kind of pleasures of seeing the building in the city, that it's a building that is so unstable that it almost connects and associates with any part of the city, whether it's fragile, rigorous, strong, modern, old, or dilapidated. You see it also, not as this kind of famous hall, but simply emerging here at night, or as part of the infrastructure of the city. And here, as part of the Chineseness of the city. Anyway, although we are proud and happy with this building, it's also a concern that it is part of this kind of skyline of absurdity. And so, as soon as we were done, we felt the urge to rethink that project. And there is, of course, one reason that all the other famous architects are making spectacular buildings, but there's an even larger pressure that all the other architects in the world also make spectacular projects, and that less and less it's possible to distinguish. This could be, excuse me for saying it, could be Norman Foster, but it isn't. And so therefore the actual quality becomes, so basically this is more and more what the city is becoming. And so therefore, when soon after CCTV, we were asked to conceive of a building in Dubai, a building central to one of its developments called Business Bay. And here we are clearly in this kind of market-driven world that I mentioned. We wanted to really do something which was not as extravagant and kind of really simple and radical in its simplicity. So basically, we proposed an enormous slab of white concrete, 200 meters wide and 300 meters tall, almost without inflection, where we basically said that kind of this building will be a kind of emblem of purity. It will be surrounded by the typical kind of modern, kind of reasonably busy and sometimes quite vulgar work of our contemporaries. And so it will set a new effort and a new moment, and simply it wants to break with this tradition of escalating extravagance and demonstrativeness. We considered it basically as if we took a piece of the old city and lifted it. It had, of course, different sections: business, office, housing, hotel, and 3 important lobbies for social life. This is one of them. We worked with the artist Anish Kapoor, and we had only one extravagant idea, which is that the building should slowly turn to avoid exposure of the sun. So with a kind of circular device, which consumed very little energy, and the energy was kind of basically captured by, so the building would turn once every 24 hours. And in that sense, of course, capture or introduce not necessarily purely conventional or reactionary building, but a dimension of newness in terms of changing constantly its character and its view. So this was our contribution to that skyline, our new period. To where I stamp. It's really one of my profound regrets that this hasn't happened. We're still hoping it would happen. And so at that point, we advertised kind of return to simplicity. And so the building next one I'm showing is kind of more or less in the same category. It was the headquarters for Gazprom. It was in Petersburg, a very beautiful historical city. Not in the center, but not far away from the center. So it is a building that had to be extremely careful in terms of context. And so the building consisted of 12 tubes, and blue is when that tube is filled with substance. And you can see that the blue is not always in the same location. Sometimes it's low, sometimes it's high. So if you put those tubes together, you get a kind of irregular shape that has an irregular top, but also an irregular bottom. And here is, everything together. And so liberated from this block, this would be the building. So you have a building where the kind of the bulk of the program is kind of in the center, but it had actually a kind of really thin occupation of the ground. So it didn't weigh on the ground, and it had a kind of irregular relationship with the sky. And we also proposed or tried to convince our engineers that we could build it out of ice. Because Petersburg is, of course, most of the time extremely cold. And ice could be a kind of very sustainable and kind of beautiful material. But in the end, we had to make it out of blue glass. And here you see it in relation with kind of some of the past. At that point, the difference and the work of my colleagues, and I will not mention them, this is our competition entry, this was another, and this was still another, became so obscene that what we kind of proposed is, and what we started in our office is a kind of department that we called generics, similar to medicine, where the patented medicine is extremely expensive. But what we proposed is that we would do unpatented architecture, kind of very highly simplistic, that would kind of resume perhaps the kind of relationship with simplicity and extreme economy of invention that Mies van der Rohe had introduced in the second part of the 20th century. So this is a Mies van der Rohe building in New York. This is a building that we propose in Shenzhen, the stock market, where we have a very simple building with a podium that would be on the ground lifted, but otherwise a very radically simple tower that kind of broadcasts the stock market to the city. And here it's being built. So this is one of the sections of the office now where we are looking whether this push for a kind of radical simplicity could actually work, what its results are, and whether it is kind of viable. We don't know the outcome yet, but we hope, for instance, to push that also in housing, and that it may eventually be a kind of return to that more serious sector of the architecture profession that I showed you before. You've seen this picture. It simply shows where we work. But in terms of human development, I could also add two other details. One is political systems, where blue is democracy, pure and simple. I think you're blue. And where in the other digits are the figures of growth. And so whether it is directly connected to the market or not, but I think we live in a kind of extremely alarming kind of moment where the systems that are wrong in quotes, grow fastest, and so therefore are the most kind of productive in terms of defining our future. And therefore, this situation is so complicated that we are convinced, and I'm convinced, that a traditional architecture office is unable to navigate in that kind of modernity. So the first part of the lecture was kind of really trying to give you an impression of how the inventions of modernity affect our architecture. But the second one is, I think, more ideological and kind of really talking not about things or inventions or mechanical aspects, but about the rest of modernization. And so for that reason, where this is still the office that produces architecture, this is the, let's say, tool or cockpit or think tank that enables us to think about this extremely difficult moment, how to navigate in this condition. And perhaps the first one is that although we work for all these companies, we, of course, working or generating knowledge if you work for a client is quite difficult. But here we try to do it explicitly and try to extract from almost every project knowledge about politics, culture, education, business, etc. So in a way, we don't only work for them. Each experience leaves us kind of wiser, and we retrieve something in the form of information, and that we use to have a kind of almost permanent overview of all the inequalities of the world, whether it's pensions, prisoners, energy, etc., illiteracy, youth. This is also kind of very important part of that same part of the world is also the youngest part. So all of that, in fact, describes a quite kind of explosive condition in which we have to work. So part of that has forced me to play a certain role in politics and to become officially European. I am European, I believe in Europe, although I'm also totally aware of how weak and cowardly Europe has been behaving in the past decade. So that is a very big concern, and in part we have been slightly active in trying to make the image of Europe more dynamic. So this is the flag, not particularly inspiring. This was our barcode, where basically we proposed a kind of barcode that went from Iceland to wherever Europe ends or will end, and that basically represents every single nation as a kind of band of colors, and shows that the more of those nations, the more beautiful the barcode can become. It was kind of once applied at a Bush visit to Europe. I've currently been participating in a group of 11 experts, such as Lech Walesa and others, to try to write a script for Europe in the next 10 years. And it was my particular role to try to focus on Europe seen from the outside, because I'm so often away from Europe. I'm kind of horrified really at the kind of image Europe presents to the outside world. But the overall effort, I would say, that we think we are embarked on is to find kind of relationships, in this landmass. We're working here, not in India yet, but a lot in the kind of Arab world. And what we want to see is what kind of connections, what kind of communication, what kind of role even an architect and even as architecture as communication can play in the kind of redefinition or closer definition of all these words and all these terms. Because I think that this new coexistence has enormous repercussions in almost any one of these. For instance, copyright, you can see how we have abused it to keep things away from other people. That's only one. Public space, you can see how we have kind of proposed extremely sterile versions of it that unfortunately are more and more adopted. And you could kind of really go down the list. And to some extent, we think that we participate in that kind of exchange. Until kind of very recently, I thought that basically September 11 had kind of isolated Europe and therefore made us more of an entity. But with the crisis of Europe of the past couple of months, I'm kind of now worried that actually this is the kind of real situation. And that this is the one we have to address in the near future. What I also want to kind of really suggest is that as part of modernization, this is a list where you see two graphs. This is the kind of urbanization of North America and Europe, and this is the urbanization of China and East Asia. And here you see a list of all the kind of manifestos that have been written in architecture by Europeans or Westerners. And so what you see is that kind of as Europe and North America expanded, we were incredibly creative in terms of writing manifestos. But now that we are flattening, we simply stopped writing manifestos at the exact moment that East Asia is booming. And I think that is really a tragic situation, that therefore in this boom there is little evidence of the kind of manifesto-like thinking that is perhaps the specialty of Europe. So to some extent we have been trying not to write the manifestos, but at least to address that situation. And that is then the other repercussion, the investigation, that we not only do it through our own work, but we're also kind of producing books and knowledge in its pure form, partly through Harvard, to address this whole situation. So we have a kind of stereo, on the one hand, to understand the situation, on the other hand, to work and operate with our work in that situation we describe. And so if you look not from our own perspective as architects, but from the perspective as somebody working in the culture today and studying the effect of the market economy, then perhaps one of the inevitable conclusions is that the commercial has infiltrated every part of urbanism, and that the escalator itself, kind of probably like the elevator, is increasingly seen simply as a tool to make money. This is an American. That all the inventions that enable shopping, kind of from the radio set to the catalog to whatever, have been used now to turn shopping from a kind of very simple condition that kind of started in markets, then became stores, then became department stores, now in a kind of pervasive situation where simply every activity known to men, whether it's universities, airports, entertainment, is completely infiltrated by this commercial dimension, and that therefore, this is kind of really the best description of current urbanism. You can kind of say simply each urbanist gesture is to introduce a service to raise money. So with our privatization, we have also lost the quality of free space or public space, which of course was the essence of urbanism. So that is one conclusion of the study we did in Harvard on shopping. The second almost obsessive study is of course what happens to architecture in these regimes, which are not necessarily democratic regimes, and with the speed of construction that is going on there. We all know the statistics. I think the Chinese have to build cities for 100 million people in the next 10 years. So they produce quantities of cities that we cannot imagine. And the study that we did 12 years ago kind of was a study in the Pearl River Delta, where basically 5 cities, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Guangzhou, Zhuhai, and Macau, were on the verge of turning into a single entity of 53 million. And basically, our interest was to be there just a little bit before and to see how that growth and how that speed was being achieved. It was partly achieved by, of course, this decision, Deng, to get rich as glorious, unleashing the market in China. And of course, infrastructure is one of the key elements. The whole area is literally stitched together with infrastructure, whether it is kind of motorways or bridges or airplanes or everything else. The destruction is really radical and seems a specific purpose of the effort to level parts of the earth that are not flat. Here you see and what is of course astonishing in China is kind of simply that since there is no real market economy, there can be speculation on a scale which is unknown to us, where, for instance, an intersection like this is simply an announcement of a future city in 10 years that will be there kind of eventually, but that doesn't have to pay for the infrastructure yet. We were totally fascinated and wanted to understand how this works and what it means for architects and what it means for architects in China. So we looked at the incidence of architects per country. So what you see here is that Europe is blessed with very many architects. America has about half, and China has a fraction. Here we looked at what architects earn, and there again, European architects earn a lot. American architects earn about half, and Chinese architects earn extremely little. And this is what the average architect builds. In Europe, we built almost nothing. In America, they built multiples of the, and this is what the Chinese architect builds. So this was, for me, the best proof and best evidence that the initiative is now definitively kind of taken away from us, and that modernization is now taking place in areas that we don't control. Of course, not literally we don't control it. We've lost the control for a very long time. But also conceptually we don't control it. Modernism, it's like a relay race. We had it, perhaps we dropped the ball, and now other people are playing with it. And so this speed can only be, I think, achieved basically not through the traditional, very laborious, very time-consuming kind of architecture that takes a lot of thinking, a lot of testing, and a lot of education. I think it's more kind of phenomenon like Photoshop, which enables you to combine any two conditions you want to combine in a single image, whether it's golf and housing. You simply merge it through Photoshop. And basically that is how this landscape is also emerging. Agriculture and skyscraper, no problem. Or a golf course and the center of the city, also no problem. Everything in this image is younger than 10 years. So what took America maybe 150 years to create Central Park and the wall around it, China took 10 years. And so therefore, it's no surprise to see a metropolis with the densest point here in the center, less than 400 meters away from rice fields. So, and it's not absurd, it's simply the new condition. And it's simply, you know, if we want to work, we have to work in this condition. And of course, in that context, we also looked at the Middle East, initially when we worked in Dubai, and published one book we called Almanac, and we recently published a second one. What we wanted to do there is kind of simply understand what was going on in Dubai. You probably know that Dubai is the constant source of incredible criticism from the West. One typical citation is Disneyland redesigned by Albert Speer, the architect of Hitler. So we cannot take Dubai seriously, and what we wanted to do is to simply understand whether there was seriousness in Dubai and why Dubai became the way it became. And so simply by looking back, we discovered that, of course, there was a history, which nobody in the West really believes that a place like Dubai can have a history. And we looked at that history and saw how, at some point, modernization was a kind of serious issue between the rulers and serious kind of modern architects. And that there was a very serious effort made at kind of planning even, and so that what now seems like a complete absurd field of the contemporary architecture actually has some kind of serious beginnings. And the first almanac was kind of us looking at the Middle East and at the Gulf. The second one is in a way more interesting because we started, and it's a series of 140 articles that are written mostly by people from this region. We're also looking at Saudi Arabia. So it's really basically the voices, local voices. So it's skateboarders in Riyadh who talk about skateboarding in Riyadh. And so it's a mosaic of the conditions in the Gulf that are slowly but surely, of course, also adjusting to modernity. We also looked at the workers in Dubai. These are workers from Kerala. In the West, very controversial. It's constantly compared to slavery. But we looked at the housing they built with their earned money in Kerala and discovered that Kerala itself is now completely transformed by the influx of earnings from these workers and therefore also a kind of radical form of modernization taking place outside Dubai. And here we discovered pictures of public space and social life and integration in Saudi, which for almost no European who hasn't actually been here would be believable. Or these are astonishing pictures simply because in our prejudice, this kind of more or less recognizable coexistence both between the sexes, between generations, and between inhabiting open space is not part of our belief. Perhaps the third significant part of kind of resisting or navigating in this wave of modernization has been in the past 5 years more and more an interest in preservation. Preservation is obviously an escape from modernization, or seemingly an escape from modernization. If modernization is going in a crazy direction, then perhaps preservation is a hedge or kind of insurance. But actually, it is not that easy. Because if this is the typical life in Beijing, the way it was, which you would like to preserve, but what you immediately discover or realize is that it's not really the physical substance that you would have to preserve, because this is probably a piece of brick in the 60s. This is plastic from the 90s. This is a kind of piece of cardboard kind of maybe from the 80s. So it's simply not a physical substance you could even preserve. And what you would like to preserve is simply this, the way people exist in the city, and the ease with which they exist in the city, and how deeply rooted they are in the city, and the intricacy of their systems within the city. But of course, that is very hard to preserve. So we looked at preservation, and again looked at the history of preservation, looked at this same cloud of inventions, and then discovered to our own amazement that kind of rather than a hedge against modernity or an insurance against modernity, preservation was also part of modernity. Because in 1790, there was the first law about preservation in France, just after the revolution. And 100 years later in England, there was another law that defined preservation. And if you think about it, it's very logical, because if there was a real revolution, so in a revolution where everything changes, you have to decide what stays the same. And in 1870, there was the Industrial Revolution, part of this wave, where you also had to decide what stays the same. So in a way, what we were able to argue is that preservation is part and parcel of modernization, and that it's not kind of an opposition, but that the two are part of the same phenomenon. If you look at the history of preservation, you see that more and more it started with monuments, then buildings with their environment, then entire districts, then entire cultural landscapes. There's even now a movement to preserve part of the moon. And if you look at what is being presented, it's not only the monuments, but also town center houses. And if you look at what is preserved now, it's really everything, from concentration camps to department stores to amusement rides to casinos to highways. So you could say that just as there is a proliferation and a constant explosion of architecture, there is ironically also a preservation, an explosion of preservation. How is that possible? If you add all the sites that are currently World Heritage sites in the world, you realize that 4% of the world is now in the hands of World Heritage, which is a really bizarre situation and a very, I think, unhealthy situation, or at least it suggests that if architecture is unhealthy right now, preservation is equally unhealthy in its ambitions. We also looked at the interval or the distance between the present and the part to be preserved. In 1880, it was about 2,000 years. In 1900, it was only 300 years. And in 1960, it was only 20 years. So what you see is that what we preserve is getting younger and younger. And so therefore, we are reaching today the kind of moment that you have to decide on the spot what you preserve. And that kind of preservation is no longer kind of something that you look at in retrospect and say, okay, this is what I preserved, but it's becoming something prospective. And therefore, even more part of modernity than, and perhaps you could see Solidaire as a kind of moment where these two are collapsed in one. So what we have been kind of trying to do is, on the contrary, to try to find a kind of more pure system of preservation, because of course the problem with preservation is that it's always about values, and typically it's always beautiful things are preserved, old things are preserved, monuments are preserved. But here we were kind of more radical and said, okay, if you want to preserve a city like Beijing, maybe you should not only preserve the Forbidden City, but you should simply create a kind of point grid of sections that you randomly preserve. Because only if you randomly preserve, do you preserve history, because you never know what history will be. Strategy in Dubai, in Satwa, this is the famous main road. It's almost a linear city of skyscrapers. Next to it, there's a kind of absolutely wonderful planned city. This is one of these kind of early planned settlements for workers, an incredibly intricate world inhabited by literally people from every culture in a kind of very vivid way. And of course, this coexistence is incredibly beautiful. And of course, this is doomed to disappear. So what we kind of proposed in Dubai is another form of statistical preservation, where we simply took this area and suggested that we could create alternate bands of preservation and development, perhaps a little bit crude, but it could also be modified in other forms, so that at all times the two conditions are present at the same time, and large sections of an area like that could retain its qualities. I'll show you one recent kind of project, which is an architectural project. We are the master planners. We have become the master planners of the Hermitage Museum in Petersburg, and this is where I think the two trends, let's say, our architecture and our looking at the world are coming together. It started in 2000, year 2000, where I was part of a delegation. I don't look very happy, of Frank Gehry and Tom Krantz. And they came as part of the Guggenheim Museum to decide what they would do with the Hermitage. And their first analysis was that in the entire Hermitage, there was no space big enough for American art. And so therefore, the analysis was the Hermitage needs space big enough for American art. But I looked carefully, and this was basically the Hermitage now, 1,200 rooms. We were adding another building of 800 rooms. So basically, I suggested, if there are 2,000 rooms, maybe we don't need more space, but maybe we can simply use this space differently. And I kind of began to look very carefully at that space and discovered that the Hermitage is used and housed in space which, according to every museum expert, is totally scandalous. There's no air conditioning, the paint is peeling, there's daylight affects work of art, but still the confrontation between this and the exterior and history is incredibly powerful. There's rooms and rooms and rooms full of treasures that are not accessible, but where simply the treasures are packed together in an incredibly exhilarating manifestation of what happens to a museum without curators. It's simply the accumulation of beauty. And here you see the most famous painting of the 20th century, Malevich black painting, a black square, barely with any protection, with a kind of horrible label, fluorescent lights, and on either side ridiculous curtains. But nevertheless, I've never had a confrontation with a work of art which is so gripping and so vivid. What our effort has been in this kind of effort of the Hermitage is to see whether we could not maintain the relative dilapidation of the museum. And of course, you're in a country with also a lot of dilapidation. Whether you could not mobilize that dilapidation against the homogenizing tendency of globalization, modernity, and everything else. So our proposal would be that we do not restore every room. We don't make everything kind of beautiful. We don't undo all the damage of 30 years or what? No, maybe 50 years of Soviet abuse. But we somehow integrated and we arranged the most beautiful works of art in perhaps the most compromised spaces, so that at all points you can have the sensation of culture and history at the same time. And we are committed to not contribute to any new architecture, but simply work on the existing substance. And since there are so many rooms, our only interventions might be, at certain cases, elimination of floor space to create kind of more revealing complexes in a way very similar to what we proposed for the very big library, architecture through voids, kind of then positives. It's 7:30. There's also time for questions, so I propose that I end here, because I try to, this is more or less the end for the two tendencies or streaks of the work come together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rem. This was brilliant. And I will try to moderate this very large crowd. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. And please, keep it brief so that we make use of the time and allow more people to speak out. And okay, please.
No, it's really a wonderful audience. So good.
May I ask those who are leaving the room to do so quietly, please, so we can carry on for a short bit of time. Okay, go ahead, please. Okay, go ahead. Ask
Hello.
your question, please.
I would like to ask you a question. In one of your books, in SML-XL, you speak about erasure in the city. And you speak how it is almost more important to build, to do the unbuilt, to erase, than to build in certain cases. How do you think that fits into what's happening now in Detroit with everything, with a lot of, big percentage of what's industrial being brought back to land from 19th century? How do you think that fits from your book that goes back to 10 years ago, making a speculation about how the need for erasure will come very soon and what's happening in Detroit right now? Thank you.
For those of you who may not know, Detroit is kind of, because it lost more and more industry, more and more population, it's reverting more or less to, in certain sections, to a kind of non-urban condition, or to agriculture, or to the previous condition. And I think the same is happening in America, also in New Orleans, where certain sections are also abandoned, and you have to think, when once a city is abandoned, what do you do with it? But that is, in a way, a little bit literal in terms of erasure. more interested in what is happening, and of course you know that in Europe there has been many programs on architecture that are about shrinking cities. I think the Bauhaus has a whole department on shrinking cities. It's a particularly acute phenomenon in the former communist world, in Russia where entire cities are abandoned, and in former East Germany where also cities are abandoned. I'm personally more interested in another phenomenon which I've called thinning, which is the way in which currently almost no new city is inhabited with the same densities or the same permanence or the same loyalty that cities used to be abandoned. In other words, if you look at Dubai, you see that even apartment buildings that are open, that are sold, that they have a theoretical population, but that only a fraction of that population is there at any given time. You see skyscrapers here that are also completely functional, completely sold, but that apparently are also inhabited during the summer. And it's not only a phenomenon that you see in cities. If you look at the countryside in Switzerland, for instance, you see that there are villages. The population of the village has disappeared, but yet the village is getting bigger and bigger because theoretically people buy apartments there to go there for only 2 weeks or 1 week a year. So you get a very strange kind of contemporary combination of visual density, but actually in social terms or in terms of human presence, thinning or disappearance. So it's kind of dense but hollow, or full and empty at the same time. And I think that is a phenomenon which is pervasive. It happens, you know, in Europe, in America, also in China. In China, you have almost entire cities that are based and built for future occupation. I think that is a phenomenon which is more important for us to understand and to somehow theorize as architects what it means for the urban condition. Because yes, there's an enormous amount of urbanization, but no, it's not urbanity as we know it, but it's a kind of much more thin and hollow and empty phenomenon.
Okay, I understand the gentleman next to you has a question.
My question is a bit less specific, actually.
Hamid, can you stand up?
Yep. My question is a bit less specific. It's about the semi-globular building that you were talking about in France, that you said seemed out of context. I was just curious as to how you thought buildings and geographic context would necessarily relate, because some of the buildings from different places sort of had more thematic relations than regional specificity.
Well, what you're asking are whether an international, how let's say in architecture, what the role of context should be or how it should address.
Yeah, like it was just actually.
Well, I think it's a very important question, and I cannot say that there's a method, because I don't think there's a method. I mean, similarity to local things, I think is obviously stupid, because every situation is in a state of permanent transformation, particularly at the moment that this army of architects is kind of involved. And so that's the one moment where you cannot say, keep everything the same, and they cannot, or simulate everything that was there. That also doesn't work. And in the case of Beijing, because that building, as you probably know, is in Beijing. In the case of Beijing, it becomes really difficult, because what would you want to address? Would you want to address the, let's say, the Forbidden City Beijing, or the Stalinist Beijing, or the Beijing made by Russian engineers, or the Beijing, etc. There are so many Beijings that it becomes in itself very difficult to address. So I can only say what we try to do. it's partly intuitive. Simply, we had a feeling that this shape, by not being explicitly orthogonal and by not being explicitly triumphalist, and by being sometimes strong and sometimes weak, and also by the kind of pattern of the structure, which somehow has some kind of resonance with kind of Chinese patterns of screens and doors, that those were the only ways in which we could hope to be associated with an unstable quantity that is the city there, or is a city at the very moment that it transforms. So I think it was basically by weakness that we hope to connect, perhaps.
Okay, can you stand up, please? Yes. Go ahead.
I don't have a question, I'm just here to pass the microphone.
Okay. Can you raise your hands if you have a question in that vicinity or here? Okay, one more question.
Was the void in the CCTV building? Excuse me. The void in the CCTV building. Does a building pass through it? Does a plane pass through it?
No, not yet. No.
I mean, was it intentionally a peaceful gesture, or?
Well, I've given you my intentions, and I think I was fairly explicit, and there are no more intentions that I care to reveal for that one.
Thank you. I wanted to commend you on your political involvement. As an urban planner, I think we need more of that if architects and urban designers are involved politically. But you started out by talking how architecture reflects private interest. And in countries in which urban planning and design, or the lack of, is dictated by private interest, how does your theory about preservation apply? And to what extent do you locate yourself as European in this theory of preservation?
Can you be a bit more explicit? Because
Yes,
I don't see why. Huh?
Well, I think I'm wondering about how do you do in countries where the concept of urban policy does not exist? And so do we allow for private interest and the market to rampage?
I'm not the one who allows. I mean, we basically intervene in different countries, and we try to be careful about the interventions, and we try to not be too ignorant of the situations in which we intervene. And we almost never have the possibility to kind of define the terms entirely, or and certainly almost never have the kind of power to define a kind of legal framework independently or almost of what exists. So what I can be specific in terms of what we did in Beijing, where of course there is an awareness of the importance of preservation, as there is everywhere else. But preservation is actually at this point maybe being taken out of the hands of the professionals of preservation. It's become a political issue. And for that reason, I think even in a place like China, there is a space to work on it. And that space is very often kind of lip service, and kind of mostly things are raised and then rebuilt, et cetera, et cetera. But in this particular case, we had the option to get one district and to try it out. And it was not our abilities as urban designers that were made the difference, but simply our ability to engage it on a political level as an important issue. The Satwa example, we tried to find a client who was actually sensitive to our argument. So, and of course, That is also the whole point about the private sector. I don't want to suggest that they're all evil or all suffer from lack of intelligence. There are many, many people who have a kind of fairly idealistic, even private investors who have a kind of relatively idealistic sense of the values they have to kind of represent. So in that case, we found one, but in the end, the sums didn't work or the timing was not exactly right. And I think what actually happened is that one day we found ourselves completely wrong-footed because another person had done a kind of scheme for the same site and the thing was gone. Yeah, one more.
Okay.
There's the one there.
One last question, please.
Thank you. How do you see Amsterdam in respect to preservation?
Is there any, do you just ask it, or do you have your own opinion about Amsterdam preservation? Huh?
Of course I have my own opinion, but I would like to hear yours.
It's a kind of really complex question, kind of because there's a small private note, which is that for the first time in 30 years I live in Amsterdam again. So I experience it now as a citizen rather than an architect. And like everything else in the Netherlands, everything is reasonably smart and reasonably correct and reasonably good and reasonably well done and reasonably reasonable. Yeah? So, and perhaps that is in itself quite an impressive achievement to be reasonable at this point in the 21st century. So, but on the other hand, of course, there's many things you could criticize about it. So, thank you.
Okay, once more.